It's 7:02 on Monday, April 8th, 2024, and I'll call this City Council study session to order. I do want to thank everyone that's joining us this evening. Just a reminder, this is a study session, so there's no public comment. And if Councilmember Strader would lead us in the flag salute.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So for the record, all council is present this evening. For staff, we have our Stormwater Compliance Officer, we have Director Madden, we have Director Simpson, we have Chief Hernandez, and we have our City Clerk. Let's see. So council, we have 3 items this evening. The first one is on page 3 of your packet. It's a discussion regarding the Hazard Mitigation 2022 to 2025. I will turn the floor over to Debbie Bailey with Pierce County Emergency Management for this presentation.
Thank you for having me here tonight. This is sort of a little bit of a formality with FEMA. You are one of 76 plans now, but you are actually one of the original 48 jurisdictions that first approved a hazard mitigation plan back in 2008. Since then, we've had 2 other updates, and this is the 3rd update for this plan right now. It currently has expired in July of 2020. I started the update in 2019 for our 76 jurisdictions, and COVID hit us in 2020, and mitigation planning was at the bottom of everybody's list, and rightfully so. So we had probably half of our jurisdictions across the finish line that were able to update their plans, and we've got about 30 that were not able to do that. So we applied for a grant a couple years ago. We were awarded it last year, but we didn't receive the funding from the state until the first part of this year, so that we can kind of help spearhead the jurisdictions to be able to complete their hazard mitigation plan. So that's kind of what I'm here today to formally gain your approval to be able to move forward so that we can update this mitigation plan. It's going to have a very short time frame on it because we're going to be looking at needing to start updating in the summertime, the 2025 to 2030 update. But I'm making it painless for everybody to be able to hit the highlights of the parts of this plan to be able to be approved. And what this allows you to do is to be able, projects that you've identified in your plan that you're at risk at, when there is a presidentially declared disaster in the state of Washington, and it does not necessarily have had to have happened in Pierce County, it opens up what we call HMGP grant funding. It's hazard mitigation grant funding. And I did pass out little pamphlets so that you guys can have future reading on some of this. And what this does is the state will select projects. You would apply and submit a pre-application. FEMA will fund 75% of that project. That leaves 25%, in the state, and I'm going to say 99.9% of the time, we'll split that 25% with you. So it's a pretty awesome way to get a project that you've identified to be funded and only cost you 12.5%. That's one of the main reasons why you want to keep this mitigation plan updated. It's a really awesome way to be able to get projects funded and not cost you a whole lot of money. So as I said, we're on a real short time frame. I'm hoping to be able to have all of these plans completed with everybody's pieces that they need to have updated with that probably by August, so that I'll be able to submit these plans to the state in September. Once that happens, the state's got 30 days to review the plans and make sure that I've met and you have all of the FEMA's requirements. Then the state will forward the plan to FEMA. FEMA has 45 days and to make exactly the same thing, to make sure that the plans met all of their requirements. Once that happens, I'll receive notification of a pre-adoption approval from them. And at that point, then I will notify you that it's in that and it's pending adoption. So I've got a template resolution that would need to be formally adopted by you. So we'd be coming back to get that formally adopted and with signatures. And then once I received a copy of that resolution, then I will submit that to the state and FEMA, and then they issue a formal letter. I insert those letters, and it'll be in the Appendix A of your plan, so there's a history of this from 2008. And so once I get that, I will insert that into your plan and then print off a copy, and then you'll get a final approval of a copy of this plan as well as the base plan. We have a base plan that's kind of the overarching plan of all 70, I think we're at 74 jurisdictional plans right now. So that's kind of a real quick, fast lowdown of what it is. The plan consists of a process section, a profile section, your capabilities, your risk assessment, mitigation strategies that you've identified, your infrastructure, and then the plan maintenance. And then we've got, I think I'm up to 6 appendices right now. I like to kind of have your mitigation strategy section, your working portion of that. So any completed projects that you've done, I'm now putting those into another appendices so you've got a record of that and that your Section 5 stays the working part of your plan. So, is there any questions? I know I've kind of, we're short on time, and I've just kind of given a real quick, fast overview of it.
Council, do you have any questions?
No?
Councilmember Whalen?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
Mhm.
It's been a while since it's been a while since this has rolled forward.
Yes.
So I appreciate seeing you coming. I need a little time to study to really ask you a reasonable question, but thank you for your presentation.
Absolutely. So, do we have?
Do we know about when this will come to council for the review?
That's however long that process takes and the end. Like I said, the state can have 30 days, FEMA can have the 45 days, and then when it comes back to you to be able to get it on your calendar, to be able to approve it. So I would like it no later than November.
Okay.
The one thing too to let you know is if there is a project, something that comes up, you can still, even though your plan is expired, you can still submit a pre-approval application. You would just need to have a FEMA-approved mitigation plan at the time you would receive that funding. And you definitely would have an approved plan by that point, because sometimes it can take up to a year. So
Okay.
you would definitely have an approved plan at that point.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. Granted, this is a formality, the plan, but how much time will we have to mull over it, actually have time to go through it?
Before I submit it to the state?
Well, before, how much time will we have to then approve it, and then it goes back to you, or we just review it? And is that just a formality, us
No.
reviewing it?
So what I'll do once all the different sections, so I'm going to be meeting with everybody on a monthly basis and going through different parts of the plan. And then through the email, like if you're working on Section 2, when that part's completed, they'll send me the Section 2. I'll override the files that I keep at work. And then once that whole plan is totally completed, I will send it to you in a PDF format.
Okay.
So absolutely, you can totally have that opportunity to be able to look at it and review it before and actually, I really do want everybody's approval before I submit that to the state, because it's your plan.
Okay.
So yes, definitely you will have the opportunity to look at it. And I've got one copy of this one that I'll leave too with you, but this is the plan that's expired, and there's a lot of changes that I've done with this update. So the current one that we're going to be working on isn't necessarily going to look like this. I've elaborated a lot on the Section 4 with the risk assessment. There's going to be updated mapping, and there's a lot more, more detail than what is in this. But
I would assume so, because it's been since, what, 2008?
no, we did a 2008 was the first one, and then the next plan would have expired in 2013. But I got an extension with FEMA. I do GIS mapping and to being able to do HAZUS analysis. And so we were able to, we had some money left on that grant. And so FEMA extended us without making everybody's plan expire so that I could do the HAZUS run. So it actually, that plan update didn't get approved until 2015. So that's why then it went from 2015 to 2020. And this one's from 2020 to 2025.
Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we have any other questions for Ms. Bailey? Councilmember Cedar?
This is just logistical. Does this plan cover our King County section as well? Part of our city is in King County, or is there some coordination that needs to occur outside of?
Yeah,
Pierce
so this is just covering Milton within Pierce County. And I know King County has mitigation plans too, and they may have one for Milton that's within King County boundaries too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay.
Are we
Thank
all
you for your
good?
time this evening.
Okay, I'll leave this with you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So council, the next item we have is the stormwater rate study. It starts on page 5 of your packet. I'm going to turn the floor over to Director Madden, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Jose Magana Bedoya will be leading this. Jose is our Stormwater Compliance Officer. For the last little over 6 months, he's been working with his consultant team that he'll introduce shortly. And all of those efforts culminated in these options that you see put forth. So to get to this point, Jose will speak more to this, but we ran through all of the capital improvement projects. This will be the second time it's been presented to council. We took the feedback from the November presentation and refined this plan to be what it is here today. So please ask lots of questions and let's dive into it. The current proposal is that this would come back for council endorsement next Monday. So this is Jose, and he'll introduce the team.
Good evening. Tonight, we will be presenting Jeff Coop, Parametrics. He will present our CIP projects. Then after that, Tagi Aker, Project Manager for FSC, will present the rate study. Thank you. Yeah, I also printed out a packet for everybody so they could have a better visual.
So I just wanted to, again, my name is Jeff Coop with Parametrics, and I just wanted to briefly go through this information because, again, as Dustin said, we went over it in November. I just want to kind of highlight a few things to refresh your memory on this. What we did before is we went through the previously identified CIPs that had not been implemented, figured out they still needed to be done, and then if anything needed to be added. So we started off with a good, clean list of projects to base the rate study on. When we were here in November, we had carried forward a CIP for Surprise Lake, and it was at that meeting it was determined to take that off the list. It just didn't seem to be viable at this point in time. So the only real difference is removing that from this, this estimate and the rate study. So the first sheet here shows the 4 projects that have been carried forward, and it has a cost broken down for each one of those. For construction, ancillary costs include permitting, engineering, surveying, geotechnical, things like that. And when we were looking at this, we looked at critical areas nearby in the project to kind of get an idea of what levels of effort may be needed for permitting for the projects. And then also what we included on here is anticipated year of design and construction. A CIP, forgive my weird naming convention, AAA and BBB, I just put those in there as kind of like placeholders because of newly identified projects. Those are both located at Porter Way. And so the thing is, the first one is replacing the existing culverts, and then the next one is completing the sidewalk between the recent project that was constructed and then down towards the south. The thing is, both of those need to be either constructed at the same time or the culverts going in first, because you don't want to have to do the sidewalks and then tear things up and then go back in and replace your culverts. So those are both slated for 2024 and 2025. So the first project to get carried forward is a CIP number 4 for 11th Avenue. That includes filling in some ditches with some enclosed drainage systems, some catch basins to pick up local drainage. And we've also included some stormwater treatment, because when you fill in the ditches and create hard surfaces, you then may be subject to treatment. So we added some of that to the cost. And so the next page here, it lists out all the different things associated with the project, the pipe, the types of catch basins, the location, and things like that. And then we also included a map from our GIS mapping that we did for the SMAP process that shows the critical areas in the project area. And then the next project was CIP 7 for Oak Street. And as we talked about back in November, with this project, it was originally, hey, it works, Jose. I should get a round of applause. I'm usually not doing this. The original project was over in this part of the city, but as we started digging into it, it looked like what would happen is it would be diverting stormwater from one threshold discharge area to another. It would send stormwater to a location where it's not currently going, and so that may divert problems from here, but then send it down here. So I thought that may not really be viable. So instead, there's plans to improve Oak Street up in here with some sidewalk and some parking along the frontage for the park. So we retained the CIP number, and it is associated with Oak Street, but it's moved in its location and in its scope. So again, there would be filling in of ditches along the road and adding some parking to serve the park, and then also upgrading some piping along the frontage. And then there's some critical areas in the area for which permitting would need to be addressed. Now the other thing about this project is it does add impervious surface, and we included some cost for stormwater management, but that can be averted through an analysis of the existing drainage system. There's an existing stormwater facility up here by the maintenance and treatment plant and along the trail, and a lot of the area drains through a conveyance system into there. So whenever improvements are made here along Oak Street, we want to make sure that we don't impact this facility here. So it includes a lot of surveying of the system to get elevations and pipe materials and types and so forth, so we can build a model to do the analysis to make sure there's no impact to this if we don't do any kind of flow control along Oak Avenue. Because the stormwater system goes along 11th, the survey for 11th would be included as part of the costs for the Oak Street project here. The CIP AAA is for replacing the culverts at Porter. There is some existing piping there, but they need to have some inspection, check the conditions, and then replace. The issue there was some flooding that occurred on this side of Porter Way. And so the pipes through here would be replaced, as well as the pipe crossing Juniper. And there's several critical areas in that project area that would need to be looked at during the permitting for that. And then the last CIP project to be carried forward would be Triple B for the sidewalk, filling in of the sidewalk through here. That would include some retaining wall. It would include some conveyance systems that would then discharge to the north side of Porter Way. Because it's sidewalk, we're based on some conceptual quantities, it looks like it would be below any kind of trigger for flow control and water quality treatment, and it's also non-pollution generating surface, so we're not including any treatment costs for that. And again, that's just a detailed view of the project area with showing some retaining wall locations that would be needed. And critical areas. So that's a high-level overview of the 4 projects that would be carried forward for the rate study. And again, no changes to the project definitions themselves since November, other than taking the Surprise Lake project off the list as requested. So, any questions on the projects themselves?
Member Cedar?
Yeah, this is a little bit higher level, but you mentioned it, and I'm curious about it. You talk about wastewater treatment. Can you just talk about what Milton has right now for wastewater treatment? And is increasing our impervious surfaces and kind of starting to hide some of our, flow essentially under sidewalks and not
Well,
allowing that
this
natural
is-
seepage?
This is separate from wastewater treatment.
I'm
The facility.
sorry, stormwater treatment. I meant stormwater treatment. Yeah, pardon me.
So yes, whenever you add pollution-generating impervious surfaces, like for roadways, parking lot, things like that, that if it's over a certain amount of area, then you do have to provide treatment for it. And that's why we've included some treatment costs for some of these projects where that would be required.
And what does that look like in terms of when you say treatment costs? Are we talking about a new facility, or does that already exist within the city?
It'd be new. What we assumed like some contact storm filter, proprietary treatment BMPs, things like that.
Okay.
So there's no existing treatment facilities where these projects are located.
Okay.
So
Understood. So all those costs are factored into what we're about to see with the rates.
yes.
Love it. Thanks.
Okay.
Councilmember Preddy?
On your one diagram, on ours, it's page 1 of 1, which actually has the whole layout of the projects on this one here. Are you increasing the size of 11th Avenue capability when you do 11th Avenue? My question is kind of surrounded about is I see that 11th Avenue actually in your charting here comes after Oak Street project. But am I thinking wrong that Oak Street is actually above 11th Avenue and that is actually going to be filling that direction through 11th Avenue?
Yes, it would be, stormwater would be
so-
flowing in that direction.
And so
that's
So
part
my
of the,
question was would 11th Avenue actually have to be completed first to take the flow that's going to come down through Oak Street as you do Oak Street?
it not necessarily, it kind of depends. There's ways that you can manage that with some temporary accommodations.
Okay.
So,
Okay, and then over on 10th Avenue where I'm looking at the topical map here on that, where you have things coming from Oak Street on the very far west end of it. It seems like it wraps around and comes back on Nevada and then gets into 11th Street again and then runs out. Am I mapping that correctly? Because I'm seeing a break line on 10th Avenue. So it seems like flow comes down 10th Avenue, but then takes a right on Nevada, goes over to 11th, and then hits the system out. Is that correct?
I'd have to look at, let's see here. Let's see here. Yes, that's the way it looks like. That's why we have that area highlighted in red, because that would need to be surveyed, because it does look like it connects together. And this is all from the GIS mapping that was developed whenever we were doing the Stormwater Management Action Plan to develop the tool for that process, as well as then use it for this effort.
Okay, I was just curious why there was that break on 10th, that it just didn't flow down 10th, but actually got transported back on Nevada over to 11th.
I think it does, because there's this includes the location of drainage structures and pipes. And so if it was like pipes and drainage structures, that's how it would be routed. So I don't think there's a continuous connection down 10th Avenue.
Okay.
So, but again, the field survey would verify that.
All right,
So-
appreciate that.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay.
Thank you. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Tage, and he'll talk about the rate study and how that wound up. That's the advance the slide, and that one's the red dot.
Thanks, Jose. So I'm Tagi Yaker, a project manager with FCS Group, and we help cities and counties in the region with different types of utility rate studies, water, sewer, stormwater, for example. As Dustin mentioned at the beginning of the meeting tonight, we were here back in November 2023. During that meeting, we presented 3 rate options, all of which included the Surprise Lake project. Feedback that night was to take that project out of the rate funding forecast. And so we're coming back here tonight to talk about the same 3 types of scenarios, but without that project included. And so we'll be looking at a little bit of a recap of what we discussed back in November, but the 2 main points would still apply. We're looking at the revenue requirement, and we're looking at the system development charge. So the revenue requirement impacts your monthly rates in terms of, we're looking at 6 years of capital projects, give or take. Do you have enough money coming in the door to pay for your staff, supplies, materials, capital projects, sort of a long-range funding plan? The second component of tonight's presentation is an update to the system development charge. That's something you don't have at this point. You have it for the water utility, not for the stormwater utility, but it would be upfront payments from development, or in some cases redevelopment, that would then go to help pay for the cost of stormwater capital projects. So a quick recap from November 2023. We had 3 scenarios, as I noted. The first one, scenario 1, was cash only. Scenario 2 introduced some level of borrowing that would help reduce some of the rate increases needed to fund the same level of capital projects. Scenario 3 assumed the most debt, and by buying down some of that cost of capital projects, spreading it out over a 20-year time frame, it could afford the lowest rate there you see in 2029, ended at $22.71 per month for that Tier 1 rate each month. And then we also had a system development charge of $416 per equivalent unit. That all included Surprise Lake. What we'll be looking at here tonight are the same types of things, pulling out Surprise Lake, so it's not a part of the funding plan and the revenue requirement, and it's not included in the system development charge calculation either. And in some cases, because we were here in November, we do have some of the same types of slides, and so those are noted in a blue box in the top right, no change from the November 2023 PowerPoint. I'll be happy to go through each of those slides if you'd like. Does council have a preference of kind of going through slide by slide, or just get into the key changes from between then and now?
Seeing head nods for key changes.
Okay. I do want to spend a minute on slide 7.
I have one quick
Oh,
question.
Yeah.
Mayor Potem?
Yeah, if you just want to give just a recap,
Yeah.
but yeah, I definitely want the key changes, but just an overview?
Yes, so our main goal tonight in the revenue requirement section is to just make sure that the stormwater utility is bringing in enough revenues to cover its expenses. Right now, as you can see in the slide 7 chart, we have a snapshot of Fund 406. And the stacked columns of Fund 406 represent the current and historical financial obligations of the stormwater utility. You've got salaries and wages in that dark bar at the bottom. Stacked on top of that is personnel benefits in that green color. Supplies and services stacked on top of that is in that purpley color. And then added on top of that, some miscellaneous expenses, as well as transfers to the capital fund and the asset replacement fund. So those are your current obligations. You can see with that dashed black line, revenues coming in the door are at least in the past 3 years, kind of at or below the annual financial obligations. So what that has done is drawn down fund balances over the past few years and really set up the utility to need some type of rate adjustments to get enough funding coming in the door to either rate fund the entire capital program, or in scenarios 2 and 3, rate fund and debt fund some of the capital projects. I skipped over slide 6 here, but I think it's worth noting that the city hasn't increased its stormwater rate since at least 2015. And so this is the tier 1 rate you can see in that bar, $15.50 per month for one equivalent unit per month. And layered on top of that is that dashed line that shows what that rate would have been if annual inflationary adjustments had been applied each year along the way. So essentially, $15.50 back in 2015 is equivalent to over $21 per month in today's dollars, just as an example. So that's a little bit of the background of the rate study that we're talking about here tonight. We'll get into the revenue requirement and then the results of the updated 3 scenarios. So on slide 9, just a brief overview of what goes into this. We want to make sure that you have appropriate levels of reserves. So that goes into the fiscal policy box there. We want to make sure that your rates are covering forecasted operating and maintenance expenses. That's the forecasted, quote, O&M you see there in that darker colored box. And then the last 2 boxes really relate to how you fund your capital projects. Is it cash only? So you're funding, setting aside from rates each year to fund capital projects? Or do you also bring in new debt service, which would apply in scenarios 2 and 3 if you were to go out for a loan to fund part of your capital program? A couple of the key fiscal policies are noted here on slide 10. There are 2 main funds at the city that relate to stormwater. There's the operating fund, Fund 406, and then there's the capital fund, that's Fund 407. And we build into the forecast a couple of minimum reserves for the capital fund. It's a couple $100,000 to have on hand so that if there were an emergency capital project, you'd have enough there to hopefully fund part or all of that without overly disrupting the finances of the day-to-days of operating the utility. On the operating fund, Fund 406, we have a minimum reserve target of about 25% of annual operating expenditures. So those are the 2 key items I think are worth noting and are built into each of the 3 scenarios. We did touch on slide 11 last time, but there is a new customer, Bridgepoint, currently in development. I'm sure you all know more about this customer than I do, but it's a multi-phased development, a lot of new impervious area, and as that development is completed in different stages, the city can then begin billing that customer and bringing in new revenues. Before any rate adjustments, there's new growth coming in to help supplement what current ratepayers are paying in terms of about $1 million per year. If Bridgepoint develops fully over the next 3 years, they would add about 1,200 or 1,300 equivalent units to the monthly stormwater fee rolls. So that would add over $200,000 per year once they're fully developed over the next few years.
Just so I can get my head around it, because the 1,260 residential units represents what? What does each unit represent? Is that like an apartment size? Is that probably square feet?
It's an equivalent unit, so each of those units is about 2,800 impervious square feet. And whether that's building or parking lot, driveways, other impervious surfaces, we're looking at the total development, and that's equivalent to about 1,200 or 1,300 homes.
That's a big footprint.
It's a big footprint. Yeah.
Okay, so that's what I thought.
All right, brief overview of the 2024 forecast. This serves as the basis for the revenue requirement. It's about 1/3 salaries and wages, 16% for personnel benefits. Supplies and services is about 40% of the annual costs. And then there's the annual transfers to the capital fund and the asset replacement fund. I think it's worth noting here that, historically, the city has transferred about $70,000 per year from stormwater operating to stormwater capital. As you'll see on the next slide, annual capital projects are expected to be about $0.6 million per year. So comparing your current historical transfer of $70,000 per year against $600,000 per year of capital projects, you can start to see what's driving the forecast is the handful of capital projects that are part of this 2024 through 2029 plan. That's before inflation. Once we account for estimated cost adjustments over the next few years, it's likely to be about $700,000 per year, or in total, just over $4 million of projects through the end of 2029. Historically, the city has relied somewhat on grant funding and also REIT, real estate excise tax, to help pay for nearly 2/3 of the annual capital projects of the stormwater utility. As you see on the next few slides, we're trying to transition away from some of that more towards a rate-supported, more of a self-sustaining utility. And so we have 3 scenarios, which we'll get into right away. Scenario 1 is cash only. This is on slide 14. And this assumes no borrowing for the capital program. And so what this would represent is a 25% rate increase May 1st of this year for a Tier 1 equivalent unit rate per month. That would be about a $4 increase to the monthly rate. We see, get this. Okay, so the top number here is the annual percentage change applied to all rates in the current rate structure. The middle number here, 1938, that's the Tier 1 rate for an equivalent unit. And then the bottom number here is the change to that monthly rate year over year. So it's about a $4 increase to the Tier 1 rate this year, about $3 increase in 2025, and then in the $1 to $2 range per year when we get into the out years. So by the end of the study period, the rates would be set up to help fund about $800,000 of rate-funded capital per year. And under this plan, about 80% of the capital plan would be from rates or existing reserves that can help pay for capital projects. We are assuming, as noted on the previous slide I skipped over, there's a couple of projects that have sort of non-stormwater elements, related to the road fund, for example. So we're assuming a small piece of the overall capital projects would be funded through some contributions from non-stormwater funds, but it's a relatively small piece of the pie there. And then there's a relatively small grant that the city gets from Department of Ecology every other year that can help offset some of these costs. But under this scenario, it'd primarily be rates and existing reserves paying for the capital projects, ending at about $27. We'll come back to that ending number when comparing each of the scenarios. Scenario 2 brings in some borrowing. This is on slide 15. We assume about $700,000 of new debt to help fund some of the capital program, leaving about 2/3 of the capital program to be funded through rates and existing cash reserves. And this would, compared to the previous one, we had a $27 ending monthly rate for Tier 1. This one would end at about just under $25 per month for that Tier 1 equivalent unit rate. And scenario 3 brings in the most debt. It'd be just over 1/3 debt funded for the entire capital program. Over 40% would still be coming from rates and cash reserves. The ending rate for the Tier 1 mark there is about $22 per month. So you can see by assuming some level of borrowing or more borrowing, it can help spread out those costs over, say, a 20-year period and reduce the monthly impact to the ratepayers, but it would be an ongoing obligation to repay the debt principal, debt interest over that 20-year time frame. So there is a balance there to be thought about cash versus debt and kind of the trade-offs with that. So this slide, slide 17, compares all three of the scenarios. $27 ending for scenario 1. Back in November with Surprise Lake, that was $29.59. You can see in that little red number there. Scenario 2 is $24.69. That was $25.76 back in November, so about a $1 savings there compared to nearly $3 savings for scenario 1. And scenario 3, again, saves about $1 compared to what we had back in November, ending rate of about $21.71 per month for that Tier 1 rate. And this is just showing the Tier 1 rates. You've got Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 rates. Those would all increase by the same percentages, but just showing what the dollar impacts would be using Tier 1 as an example. And these funding plans all assume the rate adjustment would go into effect May 1st of this year. In terms of a monthly rate comparison, you can see the Tier 1 rate here, $15.50 per month. That's on the, I'd say, the medium to low end of this survey group. Depending on scenario 1, 2, or 3, Milton's rate would jump to kind of the middle and start creeping towards this larger group here. But these all assume what we had at the time, November 2023 rates. Many of these cities and counties adjusted rates for 2024. So some of these darker colored bars would be bumping up a little bit with perhaps January 1st rate adjustments from a few months ago. Any questions on the rate plan before we get into the system development charge portion of the presentation? Okay.
Looks like we're good. Oh, Councilmember Whalen?
Thank you. Help me remember Milton's rates. They've been the same static for approximately 8 to 10 years, right? Because we had studied this quite a bit to readjust per site, you might say, let me use that word, actual impact, stormwater impact and so forth. Studied a few different things, but could never come up with a comfortable change for the city of Milton. And I don't want to go from $15.50 to $23 in 6 years. I mean, that's pretty stiff. But if we do this along the way, small incremental changes, it makes life much easier. Because again, right now, we're going to make up the sins of the past for the last 10 years in a very rapid change for the rates. And you all been paying the rates for that many years. You know what they are. And you know the difficulty we had in actually pricing the correct rate per each house setting, each lot, and coverage and so forth. So you're not scaring me, but you're giving us a very difficult task that we gave up on about 10 years ago. So, we should have been about $23 or $24 by this particular time by the study we had. Just a side question. Pervious lots, pervious parking lots, pervious surfaces and so forth. What benefit do they have to the city to promote that? We have 3 in town now that seem to function well. But what's the outlook on pervious surface to minimize stormwater impact on the city? What do you know?
I'd defer to the engineering expertise here to discuss pervious versus impervious pavement, but Jose or Jeff?
Yeah, so it can pick up on the recording, please.
The issue with pervious pavement is it still doesn't get rid of your stormwater. The pervious pavement then becomes an asset, and it has to be managed, it has to be maintained. And so even if the city even said, we're gonna do a parking lot, but we're gonna make it pervious pavement, so that way we don't have to pay for anything because it's all infiltrating, we still have an asset that has to be maintained. So you still have to have funds for that, and as well as to construct it. If someone a private property owner comes in and they do the pervious pavement to try to get out of paying for fees, if that is then their stormwater management facility and it's a commercial or industrial site, they still have to do reporting on their BMPs that the city then has to keep track of, because all of that goes into their annual reporting and documentation that the city has to keep track of. So even though someone might say, well, we're going to do pervious pavement, it's not a hard surface and we don't have to pay for stormwater management, well, the reality is there's still costs associated with that need to be borne in mind.
And I asked
So-
that question because the city owns 2 of these parking lots.
Right.
And they've functioned well, but there come a term where they need to have more maintenance management than when they're first put in. And I don't know what that cycle is, 10 years or so forth. We have one business in the city
Mhm.
that is a pervious surface. And I don't know what the impact that was. But is that an encouragement to do or not to do? Is it worthwhile to convince development to invest in it or not?
Permittees handle that differently. They tried to use that as an incentive, and then what they found is the cost to manage that was still high. So there's no incentive. There's not a financial incentive to use, most people have found, that would then find it justifiable for people to implement that.
So it wouldn't be an incentive to go to a business and ask to do that because the expenses would be higher? If they had
Not necessarily higher, but it becomes a management cost for the city, and it still has to be dealt with and administered. So it was most permittees came to say, well, if you do pervious pavement, you don't get 100% break. There may be some, but it's not a complete, oh, you don't have to pay any stormwater fees.
And that also doesn't participate in stormwater management throughout the rest of the city if they pay much less for their stormwater being pervious.
It could help reduce the size of capital systems downstream, but it still is something that has to be managed and permitted and owned, operated, and maintained. So then you'd have to really drill down on what is the amount of stormwater being reduced from this versus the cost to implement everything and manage the asset.
And I've always been interested to see from the city standpoint, with their 2 parking lots that are pervious, what the maintenance costs of those are, because I don't think we've done anything substantial. We may have done some surface cleaning, but we've not done deep cleaning.
Yeah, I don't know on that, what the cost would have been for any maintenance done on that. I don't have that information.
I appreciate that because I've always been interested to see
Yeah.
the long-term results of the pervious versus impervious parking lots. Thank you.
Councilmember Preddy?
Question for you. When looking at the rate-funded capital portion of these scenarios, is that taken into effect what our current fund balance is of our capital projects fund? Because when we look at our chart here, we have about a little bit over $3 million of projects to be completed until, basically through 2028. And understanding inflation that happens now between now and 2028, I was just curious about the amount of rate-funded capital that's going in. Is that percentage taken in effect of inflation that's going to happen over 5 years and our beginning fund balance of our current fund?
Yes to both. It does take into account forecasted inflation and also the money you have in the bank right now for the Stormwater Capital Fund.
Okay.
But I think that brings up a interesting point. Each of these scenarios ends with a different amount of annual rate-funded capital. So depending on what you think the needs are in the next 6-year period, scenario 1 gives you about $800,000 of rate-funded capital per year by 2029, $600,000 in scenario 2, and $300,000 in scenario 3. Without knowing what the 2030 through 2035 capital projects would look like, it's hard to say one's right and one's wrong, but that's something to keep in mind too as we think about what option's best for your needs. There is a different landing spot depending on the different scenarios.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay.
Okay. Slide 20, no changes here, but want to emphasize that any revenue generated from a stormwater SDC should be used for capital purposes only, not to offset operating costs, for example. And there is a particular revised Code of Washington entry that would apply, and we'll get into that in just a couple of slides. It outlines some different guardrails you want to keep in mind when calculating system development charge for a utility. Currently, there is one for the water utility, none for the stormwater utility. Just as a comparison point, you've got one for one of your utilities, and this would add a second system development charge for the utilities that the city manages. Slide 22 talks about that revised Code of Washington, or RCW reference that I was referring to earlier. Try to highlight in a different color some of the key elements pulled out. Just copied the entire block here, but some of the key terminology is new growth should pay their equitable share. You can include up to 10 years of interest. So you look at when were assets installed. You can include, if it's 10 years, 15 years, up to 10 years maximum worth of interest as sort of an opportunity cost benefit for the city's ratepayers for putting the system in place to begin with. Anything that is grant funded or developer funded, we try to identify and pull out from the cost basis to be a little more conservative, a little more defensible in the approach. And if this were a water or sewer district, there is a 10-year time frame for future projects. In the case of cities, there is no defined term limit for planned capital projects. But given the length of the capital plan we have here tonight, we're just mostly looking at the next 6 years of capital projects. So back in November, we had a $416 charge per equivalent unit. By taking out Surprise Lake, that dropped to just under $400 at $399. We had assumed that the Surprise Lake project was, I believe, 75% grant funded, so the city's portion would be 25%, but it's still, last time in November, 25% of a pretty large project. So it may not have gone down as much as you might have thought. Same message for the monthly rates we were just looking at. There are some cost savings by pulling out Surprise Lake, but we had assumed that a good chunk of it would have been grant funded. But we've got about $2 million of existing assets that you've already placed into service, about $3 million of future project costs, deducting out any grants that we're assuming, for example, or proceeds from other city funds. And the result is divided by about 13,000 equivalent units, which is the estimated system capacity at build-out. There's a little bit of background on how we calculated the system capacity with the help of city staff and parametrics. Jeff here, he looked at kind of the overall city limits, how much of that might be impervious upon city build-out, and that basically comes up with a total impervious square feet at build-out divided by the current defined equivalent unit of 2,800 impervious square feet. That gives you about 12,400 equivalent units as the quote system capacity. It's a little harder to define system capacity for stormwater utilities compared to, say, a water treatment plant or a wastewater treatment plant. It's not rated in the same way in terms of like a specific gallons per day or something like that, but we've used this approach with many other cities in the region as a way to estimate what that denominator should be in the SDC calculation. In terms of where that 399 would stack up with other cities in the region, it would definitely be on the low end there. Quite a few stormwater utilities are in the $1,000 to $2,000 and sometimes even more than $3,000 per equivalent unit. Both Bothell and Redmond have specific regional stormwater facilities that serve certain areas of their downtown core, and those are quite a bit more. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the city of Fife, and they have a stormwater utility. They currently do not have an SDC, but they're considering one, I think a little less than $1,000 per equivalent unit. So just an example of what a neighboring city is considering.
I got to go back for just a little bit and so forth. In development, single-family houses are going away, per se. Land size required for houses is going to change quite a bit. And we have accessory dwelling units. Is an accessory dwelling unit separately stormwater charged if it's a new structure? Is there a stormwater charge for a new structure, say an ADU on a piece of property, which all houses have a particular development charge? That should be charged, the development charge if it's a new structure. Is that kind of what this is leading us to?
Councilmember
That's a
Whalen,
good question.
can you pull, your mic is not picking up. Can you pull it just a little bit closer?
Thank you, and I'll try to talk more directly to it. Accessory dwelling units. They have a development charge the same as a single-family house now? I mean, how are we supposed to fund all of this with high density, with smaller lots and more people and so forth? So what's the thought there on accessory dwelling units? Now, if it's a structure that's already there, say conversion of a garage, it might be a little bit different. But what's the advice for stormwater when single-family houses are disappearing and we're going to accessory dwelling units? Maybe 3 houses or dwelling units on what used to be a single-family home.
I'm not sure what the cutoff is for the city's existing rate structure in terms of what's defined as single-family residential versus, say, multifamily development. Some cities will count duplexes as, 0.75 equivalent units per dwelling unit, so they'd be, 1.5 times. Some cities will define the threshold that, triplex and below is considered to be single-family residential. Anything above that would be multifamily residential, but I'm not sure off the top of my head what the current definition is for single-family.
I didn't know if you had actual experience with that in discussions with anybody else, but it's something we have to seriously take participation in and define how that's going to be supportive of the stormwater system or water systems in general. Thank you.
I can say that, the proposed charge of $399 per equivalent unit, it could be, as it notes here, one single-family development or 2,800 impervious square feet. So depending on the balance of, staff time to go out and measure new development, it's quite common for cities to charge single-family uniformly for the calculation of a site-specific system development charge. But there is an opportunity, if you wanted to pursue that, to charge more of a variable, per impervious square foot type of approach that would traditionally be for multifamily or commercial developments. But it is, I believe, a policy decision in terms of balancing staff time with trying to calculate the most correct, most accurate system development charge.
And to be honest with you, everything that covers ground should have a charge. Another house, a small house, garage, and so forth, for their share of participation in the stormwater management of the city of Milton. Nobody gets a free ride. And this is my point with a lot of different things that happen. I know of a small house in town that has got probably 500 square feet of small sheds, which are about the same thing as a house,
Of course, they're not using water, but they're blocking the water. And there's no, what you might say, they don't pay a damn thing to support stormwater. Just don't manage that. But in the future, that sounds like everything like that's going to have to be managed to support stormwater and not take it just from the property owner per se, or a resident. So it's a tricky subject. Like I said, we spent about 8 years trying to raise our rates, and the administration of the city gave up on it. So I don't know what the advice would be in the future for the city. Thanks. I'm just trying to relate some of the history. 20 years of thinking about this and nothing's changed.
Councilmember White?
Yeah, hi. I just had a question. I'm relating these two charts, the single-family stormwater CDC survey with the monthly stormwater rate survey. Am I to assume that if the jurisdictions on the monthly stormwater rate survey are not also on the stormwater SDC survey, that those cities do not have the one-time SDC charge?
That's a good question. Stormwater
Because there's only four of
SDCs
them.
are,
There's
yeah,
4 of them that relate between the two.
stormwater SDCs are less common than water and sewer utility SDCs. So there are still quite a few cities in the region that have a stormwater utility, but do not have a stormwater SDC. But it is becoming more common for cities to implement a stormwater SDC to go along with what they might have for a water or sewer SDC.
Okay, and what's in your calculations, what are you calculating that if this $399 charge were implemented, what are you suggesting would be the income from that on a yearly basis?
We didn't incorporate planned SDC revenue into the rate forecast, not knowing if council at what level would adopt it, if at all. It also really depends on the economic cycle in terms of if you've got a lot of growth and development, it could bring in a little bit more revenue. If it's a slow couple of years, if you're mostly built out, the available revenue that you can get from a system development charge like this might be relatively minor. But other cities in the region, it's not uncommon to generate from $50,000, $100,000 a year to a few $100,000 per year. But really depends on a case-by-case basis in terms of how early this type of charge might have been adopted compared to the big growth booms that different cities will have. It's pretty hard to predict what level of revenue might come in, but over time, any little bit helps in terms of an alternative funding source compared to monthly rates, for example.
Okay, because from what I'm seeing, it's suggesting that, or your study is suggesting that we should increase our rates substantially so that we are on the right-hand side of this chart in terms of what other cities are charging. And I realize that it's really not fair to make apples-to-apples comparisons because we can't compare ourselves to Tacoma because Tacoma has a huge property and tax base and more buildable land than we have. So I get that part. But we are a small jurisdiction, and to increase rates by the rate that we're being asked to approve and add an additional one-time charge, I'm not seeing really any correlation between that one-time charge and the projects that are getting done. So what is that justification, other than just to pad the budget, to justify that charge to the property owners that are going to be asked to pay it?
So the
And-
one-time charge would only be for new development, or in
Exactly.
some cases, if you're redeveloping to a higher intensity.
The Oak Street project, for example, if somebody builds a house somewhere else in the city, if that money is going to be funneled to that project that has no correlation whatsoever to that development, how is it justifiable?
It's a citywide charge, but you're right. There could be that instance where somebody develops over here, there's a project over there, but over time, I guess the idea would be that there's a
I mean,
capital program.
we have other impact fees, like park impact fees. You can sort of say to that landowner, well, we're going to improve our parks, in which you will have access to. But to do stormwater improvements on the other side of the city, it's a lot less compelling and less understandable that we would want to charge somebody that wants to make Milton their home for a project that they're going to have no benefit from.
It is a way for growth to help pay for the cost of having existing infrastructure in place and plan future projects, but it is a policy choice. Council does not have to.
And I'm
You don't
just-
have to adopt the charge.
I'm just bringing this forward because that new development is going to end up paying these increased monthly fees. So they are going to be paying into that fund and supporting the system. So I'm just not a fan of the one-time development fees because development, it's just one more cost that leads to making housing unaffordable. And I realize next to the other fees, it's not a lot of money, but it all adds up to a lot of money. So
Tagi, may I make a point? Just, it's the way that we've viewed SDCs in the past is a way to capture opportunity. When growth happens within the city, let's capture some of that growth and offset future costs to the ratepayers. Because at the end of 2028, there will be more storm projects to come. And if we start capturing some of those costs, we can, you said earlier, pad the budget, but we can offset future rate increase requests. So that's the way that I'm looking at it. And just to kind of give a very simple explanation of what would have happened if we had a SDC when Bridge came on board, that would have been $502,000 that would have been contributed towards the capital project list, which is quite significant.
Councilmember Cedar.
Thanks for this. This is a good discussion too. And Councilmember White, I just want to echo, I agree with you that we shouldn't be imposing costs on, especially on new buildings, like the addition of ADUs. I don't think as a policy choice we should be doing that, which is a discussion we had previously about trying to reduce some of those impact fees for that gentle density. However, I could see it for larger developments. So maybe from a policy standpoint, we could have something where a commercial development or switching a single family home into a fourplex or something, we draw a line somewhere where we do increase that. I could see that being a line. But right now, I do tend to agree with Councilmember White, just to state my opinion, that I don't see a good justification for the SDC, within the rate structures and with this rate increase that we're going to be adopted.
Any other comments before we move forward? Do you have more presentation? I'm sorry, you got cut off.
I think that was about it. Maybe we had a summary slide that just showed all of the options on one, slide 27 here. So we've got, scenario 1, 2, 3. Scenario 1, no borrowing. Scenario 3, with the most borrowing. And you'd end up in about $27 per month, $25 per month, or $22 per month, depending on the scenario. And then, whether or not you adopt the SDC, it certainly is a policy choice. You could adopt anything up to that charge. It could be lower by policy. Could be something you phase in over multiple years, $100 per year type of a thing. But I would say that if you go with rates lower than what we show here, and you don't make up the difference, say, through borrowing, either you're going to have to get more revenue from grants, or continue to put more REIT funding from the general fund towards stormwater capital projects, or defer some of the capital projects that we discussed here tonight. And I'm not recommending delaying capital projects. I wouldn't have the expertise to note what the consequences or not might be for deferring some of the capital projects. But in terms of completing the capital plan that city staff and Jeff from Parametrics have put together, these are the three options that we've put together to fund that plan in the timeline given to us. So that there are some trade-offs if you don't ramp up as quickly here in terms of other funding sources being needed, or perhaps there could be some impacts of funding your planned capital projects down the road.
Councilmember Strader?
You said these charges would be for, are related to stormwater impact, right? So what about the other impacts to the services of the city with these new developments? Or do you have data that shows what is the overall cost? Say a new development comes in, and what is that overall cost to the city, so that they also are paying the fair share for all of the services, not just stormwater? Do you have that data, or is yours strictly focused on stormwater?
Just focused on stormwater here tonight.
Okay.
But that's a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Councilmember Cedar?
So just thinking about something that Director Madden said there, as we progress into past 2029 here, in other jurisdictions that have maybe had a more systematic approach to their rate increases for the last 5 to 10 years, are you seeing the same kind of need that we have now to dramatically increase? So for instance, in 2030, or as we approach 2030, do we need to be anticipating another 20% jump in rates in order to get back to a stage and then do this 3% climb again? Or is that 3% climb kind of designed to be consistent and match inflation, so we'll be kind of good to go, barring some major unforeseen project need?
I'll answer that in a couple of ways. One, these ending rates of, $22 to $27 per month, there are quite a few cities in the region that are already at that level today, even ones that aren't listed in that survey that we put up on the screen. But I think a lot of it has to do with what comes out of each NPDES permit cycle, which, it's not my area of expertise, but every 5 years or so, there are different requirements that come about that can lead to both operating and capital changes in the way you do business. And that can be hard to predict, but there does seem to be a cycle every so often that with stronger requirements for different areas, there often are associated projects and/or compliance permit types of costs. So it's hard to predict, I guess.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And for the benefit of my colleagues on this side, I saw some very aggressive nodding about, and I think it's signaling how the two parts of the presentation tonight work together. Is that correct? That we design, or we identify the need, and then this rate study is designed to match that need. Is that what I'm kind of seeing you nod in agreement to back there?
I was nodding in agreement to the comment about the NPDES permit.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Am I misunderstanding something about how, we're going to revisit this then in 5 or 6 years? We have a little bit of sticker shock, I think all of council does from this, which is understandable. Are we going to, I know you can't tell me for sure, but are we doing this now so that we don't have to do it again to this same degree? Is that the idea?
It's pretty common to, revisit your rates every 4 to 6 years for any given utility, just given the number of things that can change. But there are some ways that you can, if you were to adopt these rates here, if you didn't have another rate study for some years after that, you could build into city code an annual inflationary adjustment based on consumer price index or the construction cost index. City of Fife has that. They've got it on their website in terms of a formula they put together. So 2 years ago, it was automatic 10 point something % based on the consumer price index. Last year, it was 4 point something percent. That sort of bridged the gap in between rate studies, and then we went back to kind of help them. Do you need to recalibrate? Is that working well? So that could be something you might consider if you were to adopt one of these scenarios. Once these, I guess so, quote unquote, expire, you could move to more of an inflationary type of adjustment that might keep things up to date for quite a few years after that. It could be that there are new projects and new requirements that may not be sufficient, but if that was something, I hate to look back, 10 years and say, what if, but if you had been doing it, 3% per year since 2015, you would have been avoiding some of the sticker shock of going from 1550 to what could be, low to mid to high 20s in just a few years. But
Yep, thank you, I appreciate that.
Councilmember Hall?
So in scenario 2, we have a 7.7 million debt on, and then we have 1.8 for scenario 3. What would be the interest charges on top of all that? Because that's not including it, right? Through the 20 years or however we do it. So we have to take that into account as debt
right,
as well. Is there any way we could capture something like that?
we're assuming 4% interest rate, and that level of annual debt service that's associated with, was it $700,000 or $1.8 million? We are assuming that rates can cover that in addition to rate-funded capital. That's built into the rate forecast.
Oh, it is?
Yeah,
It is built in, right?
we don't forecast 20 years out in the future, but if you look back on one of these examples, you see here the debt service here in this color,
Mhm.
and a little bit smaller debt service sliver here.
Okay.
So we do build the capacity into your monthly rates to handle the different levels of debt in each of the scenarios.
And then the next question would be, how would we fund that? How would we pay for that?
Pay for all.
What's left? Say we decide to go with 2. How does the city, does it go back into the budget? How are we going to pay that?
Pay the loan? You've built that in there, correct? It's built into whatever scenario you all choose.
But we would have to put that in the budget. It would be something that would show up
Yes.
every year. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. Because that's where the level of reserve is getting lower because you're paying off that. The money that you're making off the rate increase, part of that is going to pay off the interest. And it depends, do you want to have a big reserve at the end? So then you have that cushion that you can do different stormwater. Same thing if with the water side, same thing. If you want to make improvements, you've got more money to use to do that. Just depends what your philosophy is. If you want to have that cushion at the end of the life of it, and if they foresee that we're going to need X, Y, and Z for stormwater in 6 years, then it would behoove you to lean more toward going on the cash because you're going to capture more of that.
Right. I don't like
That's what I
debt.
think we all have to mull over, how do we want to tackle this? And also look at how is it working for the water system? How is it, and now, because we've been using the SDC for how long?
CPI?
With water.
CPI?
No.
No, but do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know when we started, I don't remember when we started using that.
My thing is, how has it positively affected water? And you could extrapolate that into, that's possibly what it'll do for, if we incorporate that, that same strategy with stormwater. I guess that's what I'm getting at. That's what I'm mulling over in my head is, I have to go over this more, figure out, what I think is the best strategy for the city. And yes, I don't like raising rates on people too, but, you know, it's like how REIT works. Yes, we have, everybody's paying into REIT, but you may be, same thing in the scenario of doing road repair. I don't use that street, but you could down the road. REITs are going to be, you know, used to repair that road, that street. So it goes around. That's kind of what you were saying before.
Director Madden.
Thank you. Tagi, do you mind going back to slide 7? And this will be my last question. I just want to make sure council is apprised of they're not consequences, but just what will happen if we do not increase rates at all outside of delaying capital projects. What will be other outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think worth reiterating here, we've got, revenues over the past 3 years, 2021 through 2023, and this, a little hard to see, hopefully it's a little brighter on your printout, but the dashed line here is your annual revenue coming in the door. It's below what your annual expenditures and transfers have been and are projected to be. So you've been drawing down the balances from, maybe $400,000 or $500,000 to just under $400,000 below, in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. So you've got limited time to sit on your current rates before you're drawing down your operating fund reserves, for example, let alone, the $3 to $4 million of new capital projects that you've got. So capital projects is, I think, the key driver, but you've also got to make sure that you're covering your annual operating expenditures and planned transfers to the capital fund and to the asset replacement fund. And currently, the past few years, it's not been happening. So you've been drawing on reserves to make some of those payments. And not uncommon, especially for stormwater utilities, to have what was probably working well 10 years ago with the rates as inflation has crept up, has really eaten into the ability to fund capital projects, and to some extent is now eating into the ability to fund planned operating expenses.
So Director Madden, what do you need from council? I mean, what would be helpful for next week's meeting?
Perhaps if we did a round table and the preference between the different scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah, that would, and even if it's the first and second, a general understanding of where council lands with borrowing.
Okay, and the SDC as well?
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
So Councilmember Whalen, obviously you guys all can think about this over the time, so we're not holding you accountable for anything, but if you had to vote tonight, like what direction would you be leaning in?
I'd like to calculate what year did we, 1550?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably 20 years. It's been 50-50. I'm not sure about that, but I'd like to know that. And then I'd like to add where we should be today by the general price increases of everything we have to do. What would that number be? I'm pretty sure that, I can't think of the date. 1550 is the charge. A previous mayor in her first term wanted to go out and do a total scope of the city for water, or for storm water, or for water charges, excuse me. And it was a very, very difficult task. But you're going in your 6 years, 10, that's 13 years ago. What would the rate be if we had raised it 2% a year? Instead of waiting 16 years to raise it to a rate we have to survive with. The thing is, if you don't do it early enough when you recognize it, it compounds itself, and it becomes more of a problem for ratepayers to pay a higher single increase than a moderate increase over so many years. Some years you're going to do bigger projects. We may have to put another % or 2 on it just to get it done without borrowing money, which costs to borrow money. So you have to have that flexibility. that if you have a project coming up in 3 years or 4 years, because we just invested $1 million in well 8, is that my recall?
Deep well.
Deep well. So, I mean, there's things that come up that you've got to not only be able to survive on the rate you charge, but also save monies for the future. What would I do? I'd look back and see how long it's been and just calculate what would it, if we had, in 12 years ago, if we had raised it 2%, where would we be on this chart?
Okay, so we can look at calculating that, but for this purpose, I mean, do you want to borrow? Do you not want to borrow? Because I don't think that number is going to have a relevant, I mean, they're asking us to approve one of these scenarios, right?
Oh, I'd go scenario 1 if I was going to do
Okay, so you
anything.
prefer not to borrow.
Pardon?
You prefer not to borrow money.
I prefer to be smarter about money, yes, and
Okay.
borrowing money is not the smartest thing to do.
Okay. And as far as the SDC, do you have an opinion on that, the $399 for new development? You can have no opinion at this point, just,
Yeah, I think that's dirt cheap, and we're selling ourselves dirt cheap.
okay.
It has to be what by the department says, in order to sustain without going grossly over in huge increases and so forth. What is the appropriate charge there? And cities much similar to ourselves in a growth area and so forth. What's the development charge in Edgewood? What's the development charge in Algona? I don't know what that is. What constitutes a development charge is everything you got to do to make this system work and to pay for some future development in it.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
No, I think that's too low, and
Okay.
I can't tell you how much struggle there was 8-10 years ago trying to get this 1550, which was in place for at least 8 years before that, or I don't know what it is. You give me good numbers.
Okay. Councilmember Hall, do you have are you leaning one way or the other?
The $399, I could agree with, except for like ADUs. I think we have to define that because we originally were trying to approve those, or we did approve those, and not have it cost an arm and a leg for somebody to put in an apartment in a garage or a small house. But we also have to be aware that it's going to cost the city money to maintain these, just like at the water. So that's my feelings on that. I am disappointed that we're continually put in this situation where we have to raise rates because they weren't done previously. And it's not a blame game. It's not anything like that. It's very uncomfortable. I'm getting ready to retire, but I cannot justify borrowing money. So I'll go with one.
Thank you. Councilmember Strader?
I think the city needs to make the decision based on what is the cost of doing business. And I agree with Councilmember Whalen that, we can't sell ourselves short on this. If that's the cost of what it takes to justify those charges, then that's what we should go with. And I certainly don't want us to have to borrow money. So that would be my opinion.
No debt, okay. Councilmember Cedar?
Yeah, I will only vote for a no debt plan. And as far as an SDC, I'm undecided.
Undecided, okay. Councilmember Preddy?
I'm for scenario 1, cash only. I am a household of 2 retired people in a house and understand the cost of what it is to live in the city, and I understand the cost goes up. I see it in everything else that's going on. But again, I'm for cash only basis on that, and living with the fees, that's just something that we have to deal with. It's unpleasant, we have to deal with it. For assist development charges, I am all for that because I think that prevents a lot of things down the road, and especially when it comes to a rate structure of ongoing things. and $399 for new development, to me, that's, for us to squabble about that, my opinion is that's nothing, when you're doing new development.
Okay. Councilmember White?
I am for the debt-free option as well. It's unfortunate that rates would be increased so substantially. But we have to be able to pay our operating expenses, and the fund balance will go away eventually. So I'm against the SDC charge, or the I realize I'm in the minority there, but I've never been sold on impact fees, because look at what's happening in this instance. We're going to go from $15.50 to $27. The system development charge would have been negligible in terms of the requirement to raise rates. So, and it plays out in all other impact fees, the school impact fees, the park impact fees, the traffic impact fees. They're sold to the public as making development pay its own way, but they never do. It just causes the cost of housing to be increased, and it's a contradictory to the public desire to have affordable housing when you keep adding all these fees onto development. And we're asked to pass school bonds all the time, fire bonds, and there's impact fees for all this stuff. So if we need the extra money, work it into the rate. Development will come, they will pay like everyone else, and it doesn't add to the cost of development. So that's my feeling there.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem?
I go with the cash only. I like the idea of having that lump sum, you're covering yourself, so then for those future capital projects, and it's not like you have to spend it willy-nilly. I mean, you can hold on to the funds, yes, and then use them when you're going to need them. It's just, I think it's nice having them there. You're actually benefiting the city, benefiting the citizens of the city with having that foresight to having the funds there if things are needed to be done. And I am for the SDC for the same reason, that it helps you've got to, other than just maintaining and operating, you also have to be able to develop your capital system. You have to, it involves technology that is going to, in some way, need to be upgraded, and I think you need that financial cushion in there to be able to make that happen. Because you also don't want the citizens to come back and say, why didn't you do that? Kind of like Councilmember Whalen said, is, then you're actually hurting the citizens more if you let it go that long. And then you've got to increase the rates. We went through that with the electrical, we went through that with the water. And I think we should learn from that we need to keep better tabs on that, so we aren't having the citizens of the city go through that sticker shock.
Okay. So I think we have enough feedback to move forward for next week. Do you have a last question, Councilmember Whalen?
Just one other thing. If you look at this page and so forth, if we were smart enough to raise the rates $1 a month, back when it was first counted and so forth, we would far beyond $27 in those amount of years. The thing is to be smart of what you need. Get yourself a little extra so you don't have to borrow money if something goes wrong. And always keep a positive fund value. And that's what we're trying to do. If you look back, I can't tell you what the year was, but I think I've been paying $15 for the last 40 years. Sorry, I think so. I don't remember, well, when stormwater came in and got a charge and so forth. But raising from $15, or let's just say in 2027, you're going to raise from $25.45 to $26.21. We're talking about 70 cents, 70, 80 cents. Once you get there, it can be small increments, but you've got to get to where we can sustain and provide service to the customers. So thank you for the second chalk.
So thank you to both the presenters this evening, and we'll bring this back next week to council. So council, we do have one last item this evening. It is on page 55 of your packet. It is the fourth quarter of 2023 financial report. Oh, and I'll turn the floor over to Director Simpson.
Hello, council. The layout of this report kind of shows what the actual was in 22 and then what the actual is in 23, and then also where 23 was in comparison to the budget for 23. So looking, just comparing 2022 to 23, I was just going to point out some of the big themes, and it's a lot of things we talked about tonight already. Looking at page 57 for general fund, the second item, licenses and permits, you can see that the revenue was far less in 23 than in 22. And as you know, you had a lot of, or some extremely large project, and then that had a lot of those licenses and permit fees with it. And while it was considerably less in 23, it was still more revenue than was budgeted, because I kind of see the budget as what was expected, what was planned. 2 lines down, charges for services. Compared to 22, that one went up. So now some of these projects we are able to charge services for. So that one actually ended up being a lot more revenue than budgeted. And then the last thing on this page I wanted to point out was in the expenditures, 558 planning and community development. That expenditure did go up 22 to 23, but it also went up about 200,000, 21 to 22. So I see that as planning ahead, spending those costs before you do projects, kind of laying that foundation that to build on. The next few pages are some smaller funds. So not many like large dollar changes. When we get to page 64 and 65, REIT 1 and REIT 2, these were both a little less in 23 and than they were in 22. They were also both less revenue than budgeted. But I wanted to let you know that in 24, it looks like we'll be able to bring in more revenue than budgeted just because this first quarter from Pierce County, we received a lot of REIT revenue. So that's a positive, but
She said that we received more REIT money than expected in the first quarter. Yeah, REIT.
Okay.
you know, in the year ahead, as we look at this each quarter, we'll kind of see how that's progressing. But so far, that does look favorable. But I realize there's a desire to use this revenue for a variety of things. So going to the next page, the traffic impact fee that's been mentioned briefly tonight. 23 was a lot lower than 22, but it was still higher than budgeted. Because we don't have those huge projects coming in, we're not expecting to see those revenues like we did in 22. Moving on to page 68, Fund 310 for capital improvements. As we go through the next few pages and we look at some of the capital improvement funding for our different areas, we're going to see a continuing theme, and that is, if you see line 594 for capital expenditures, we had quite a bit of unspent budget that we can then carry forward into 2024. So that's great, but as we've kind of seen, sometimes doing a project costs more a couple years down the road than it did a couple years before. So that's something we have to watch out for. Yes?
What were the reasons for the expenditures? Why didn't we spend that money? The reason for the carryover for that money?
Regarding these projects, I think Director Madden could probably talk about that more.
A lot of it is deep well. A significant amount of the 2.6, yeah, that's carrying forward. And then project delays. We've had Val Bunos on for a month, and so he is finding his stride, and we expect to pick up a percentage of completion per year.
Thank you.
Okay, and then going on to page 70, the electric capital improvement fund. Again, we see some capital expenditure budget that wasn't used that will now carry forward into 24. So when we review Q1 of 24, you'll see that rolled into the 24 budget. Oh. Yes, that was the electric capital improvement, Fund 402.
And then I just want to correct my previous statement. When we were talking about Fund 310, the deep well is not within that fund. It's actually in a different water fund. So the primary reason for carryover there is project delays.
Page 72 is the Water Capital Improvement Fund. There you see that large carry forward that Director Madden has addressed. And then lastly, on page 75, we've talked a lot about stormwater tonight. In 23, the planned projects for stormwater didn't have any expenditures, so that will carry forward. The last time I met with the Finance Committee, we talked briefly about how Val was just, I see him everywhere, and just for me and my role, noticing my colleagues asking for, hey, what's the account number for this project? So just a little bit from my view, I do see projects getting started and I see him working. I just see him everywhere. So those are all the big items I have. If you'd like more detail of any of these items, I can definitely look that up and just email me anytime. And if I send out any information to a particular council member, I'll just send it to everybody on that same email. Then we'll all have it.
Do you have any questions for Director Simpson this evening? Okay. Wonderful. So seeing that all items have been concluded, I will call for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second? Okay. Any objection? Okay, meeting is adjourned at 8:48 p.m.